Growing up, I thought my Uncle Ray was the coolest guy in the world. He was my dad's younger brother by 4 years. And while Dad was a straight-laced detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Ray ran a surf shack down on the beach. He wasn't a loser, not by any stretch. That surf shack was a brick-and-mortar business with half a dozen employees and a six-figure turnover. But Dad still looked at Ray like he was his wayward kid brother. Even if he did love him to death, he had a beach house down there on the shore, and we drive over there a few times every summer to hang out with Ray and his girlfriend Nana. But then one summer we were all packed up and ready to head down to the beach when my dad suddenly told us Uncle Ray was busy and we had to wait for another time to go see him. We could still head down to the beach, just not to Ray's. And while I remember being disappointed in the moment, I think I'd forgotten about it as soon as my toes hit the sand. I was only 7 back then, so still very innocent, and the sudden change of plan didn't strike me at all as suspicious. But what I did notice was how different Mom and Dad seemed to be acting, and how much they talked in hushed tones while me and my brother played in the sand. I didn't question it. I was too busy building sandcastles and all that. But then the next day, Mom and Dad sat me and my little brother down on the couch and told us that Uncle Ray had been in a car accident and had gone to heaven. I won't tug on your heartstrings too bad going into all the details, but the loss of Uncle Ray had me sad for a long time. But like all things of that nature, the grief subsided over time and life went on. I grew up, graduated, got a job, then was living up in Oxnard with a girl that I've been dating for a few years when we drove back down to Santa Monica to visit my parents. We hit the road, had dinner with my parents, and then we were on her way back up to Oxnard when my girlfriend got very quiet. And mopey, I asked if she was okay. And she said, yeah, she just got a little weirded out sometimes whenever she was near that part of the Pacific Coast Highway. And I asked why. And this is what she told me 20 years before her mom's old high school friend went to stay in a log cabin with her boyfriend of many years. She told my girlfriend's mom all about it, where it was how long she was going for and when she was expected to return. So when that date comes and goes, and there was no sign of her friend, my girlfriend's mom starts to get worried, and she wasn't the only one either. The girl's parents called the cops, told them where their daughter had been and who with, and then asked them to go looking for her. A few days later, they got the bad news. A car belonging to their daughter's boyfriend had been found having been deliberately driven off the road. He was inside dead from a broken neck while she was in the trunk cut up and wrapped in plastic. The cops never figured out how or why the girl had been killed or why her boyfriend had driven his car off the road. But his prints were all over the plastic wrap, so the conclusion seemed obvious. My girlfriend said her mom took the news really hard. She met the guy a bunch of times, and he seemed like a really sweet dude. She used to get emotional sometimes while driving down that spot in the highway too. I guess being where it happened was just a little too much for her. I'm listening to the story, something like, damn, that's terrible. And then my girlfriend said the girl's name sort of something like, poor Nina, hell of a way to go. And I think that I must have driven for maybe a minute or two before I respond. Wait a second, did you just say Nina? When my girlfriend confirmed, 2 thoughts flashed through my head. The first was the memory of Uncle Ray having a girlfriend named Nina, and the second was remembering how he died in a car accident, but no one had ever said anything about it being on purpose. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered the name of the boyfriend, the one that had driven off the road, and I remember how when I did, this sort of panicked feeling started rising up in my chest. The only thing that kept it in check was this little voice in my head saying stuff like, it's just a coincidence. This is pattern recognition gone wrong. There are plenty of Nanas around and you're freaking out over nothing. But as soon as my girlfriend spoke next, that reassuring voice got up and walked out like a rock star at a bad interview. And she says, I think it was like Ron or Rick or something. And then I asked, was it Rye? And she sprung around in her seat saying, yeah, it was Rye. Did you hear about this already? I didn't say anything in reply, I guess, because I realized I had to concentrate on the road instead of the chaos unfolding in my head. Then the next chance I got, I pulled over to the side of the road, asked my girlfriend to wait in the car, and then got out and called. My mom and dad on my cell phone. It was almost 9 by then. So mom was in bed and dad was up watching TV. So it was him that answered the phone. He could tell something was wrong just from the way that I was talking. So right as I'm asking if mom was asleep or just dozing, dad interrupted saying, "Just tell me what's going on." I remember pausing to gather my thoughts and then just asked him, "Dad, how did Uncle Ray die?" And he told me, "Do you know how it was a car accident?" But then I asked him if it was really just an accident or if something else had happened. It was his turn to pause, like he was sort of gathering his thoughts. And then all he said was, "Come by the house tomorrow. I'll explain everything." And I felt weirdly numb getting back into the car. And although my girlfriend basically demanded to know what was going on, I couldn't find the words to tell her until we were back home and safely off the road. I had this irrational fear that unless I kept myself together on the road, I'd end up dying in a car accident too, like some inescapable loop from some overcomplicated horror movie. But obviously that didn't happen. We got home safe. I grabbed a beer out of the fridge. Then me and my girlfriend had a teary heart-to-heart where I explained everything, including the part where my dad had all but confirmed my tears. With that, "I'll explain everything" line, she kept saying, sorry, like it was her fault for telling me, but it wasn't her fault. It was Ray's. I could barely sleep that night. And when I did manage to drift off, I had this ultra vivid nightmare where my dad took me into the garage and showed me Ray's body. I woke up before he opened the coffin, but it was enough to have me splashing my face in the bathroom sink while I waited for the shakes to subside. A few hours later, I was back on the highway, driving down to Santa Monica to talk to mom and dad. I expected things to get ugly, emotionally speaking, and boy did they ever. Mom was already crying when I got there. And the first thing she did was give me a big hug and tell me she was sorry that they never told me the truth. Obviously, I already had an idea of what that truth was, but hearing all the details was still one of the most chilling and disturbing experiences of my whole life. Dad said all the same stuff my girlfriend had, that Ray and Nina had gone to some log cabin for the weekend. He was supposed to return on Monday morning, but then Monday afternoon he called Dad from the road. Dad said he sounded mad, that he was ranting and raving about something, but nothing he said made any sense. He mentioned that something happened in the cabin, but Dad couldn't get the details out of him, and then all of a sudden Ray just hung up. Dad said he figured that he called from the road because he could hear traffic in the background of the call. Then later on he tried calling Ray at home, but he didn't pick up the phone. He called him the next morning too, but still got no answer, which was the same day that we were supposed to head over to Ray's to spend a day at the beach. But then literally a half hour before we were set to leave for Ray's, Dad spots a car out front. He walks outside, and it's two detectives from the local police department guys that he knew personally. And that's when they told him that Ray had been found and that it wasn't good news. Dad didn't work homicide. And even if he did, there's no way he'd have been on that case. But he still got all the info from his fellow detectives. And it was all those extra details that changed the whole thing, from something they might talk to me about someday to something they'd never willingly bring up with me at all. The first thing that really got Dad's attention was when the homicide detectives traced Ray's movements to the cabin he and Nina had been staying in, which was up near Redwood Deck, part of a collection of 5 whose rental costs made their owners a lot of money. The cabins were in a nice sleepy patch of redwoods up near the falls, but they were never quiet. And apart from a couple of weeks during the June gloom, the cabins were fully booked almost all year round. But then during the weekend, Ray and Nina were staying there a weekend in September. All 4 of the other cabins were empty. The detectives found out when they tried to find witnesses staying in other cabins, people who could testify to Ray's behavior or state of mind around the time of Nina's murder. They'd also heard about how popular the cabins were. So imagine their surprise when they found no bookings at any of the other cabins. They hadn't been closed for the weekend. They hadn't been reserved. There was just no bookings, none except Na and Uncle Ray. This led to homicide detectives questioning the owners of the cabins extensively, but there was no indication they were involved. The next things that didn't add up for the homicide detectives was how on the day Ray and Nina were due to drive back to Santa Barbara, where they were living at the time, and just up the highways. Uncle Ray, this led to homicide detectives questioning the owners of the cabins extensively, but there was no indication they were involved. The next things that didn't add up for the homicide detectives was how on the day Ray and Nina were due to drive back to Santa Barbara, where they were living at the time, and just up the highways from Santa Monica. They'd stopped at a gas station just hours before Ray called my dad, ranting and raving. Only the clerk remembered them acting perfectly normal. Ray pumped some gas, bought a soda, and then they left together like nothing whatsoever was wrong. But then somehow in some place over the next 20 m or so, Ray pulls over Chops, into little bits, and then wraps her in plastic before throwing her in the trunk of his car. The detectives couldn't work out if Rye murdered Nina before or after that creepy phone call he made to his dad. But they know that not long after the call was made, he went and drove himself off the road after unfastening a seatbelt. Or at least that's what appeared to have happened, according to the scene. I remember my dad telling me all this, with Mom sitting next to him, holding his hand. He was always a really strong, stern kind of guy, but telling me that story was the only time I ever saw him well up with tears. It wasn't just the sadness of it all either. It was the frustration of not knowing why, of having all those unanswered questions about the cabins, Ray's state of mind, and what he'd said during that phone call. Because the phone call he made during the day of the murder was something that scared the crap out of my dad. Obviously, once they learned about the call, the detectives wanted to know what Rye had said to my dad, but all he had to tell them was nothing. They asked him to clarify, and my dad told them pretty much what he told me. It was just words Dad said, that not a single thing that he'd said made any sense, that it was all just random words. He said he concentrated as best he could, trying to work out what he was saying. But then he got this weird sinking feeling when he realized Rye had just gone nuts. He kept telling Ray to calm down, that he'd call him at home in a couple of hours to see if he was okay, but he never picked up, and that was the start of everything. I remember how by the time Dad had finished, I just felt kind of numb. I rolled a few tears when my mom and Dad cried, but that was just because of seeing how upset they were. I felt numb because I'd been thinking about it throughout the whole sleepless night prior, so maybe 15 hours straight. I'd questioned it, accepted it, and then questioned it some more before accepting it all over again. So when the time came to hearing all the gruesome, gritty details, I was just sort of resigned to it all. I guess Mom and Dad kept apologizing too for keeping the truth from me for so long, as well as in a more general sense that things had to happen that way in the first place. I reassured them in every sense possible, saying I understood why they did what they did, because how the hell could you ever expect a younger person to process something like that? But that didn't seem to do much for them. I guess it was all that emotional spilling out after years and years of pretending everything was okay and not being able to talk about it openly. We were all emotionally wrecked by the time it came for me to drive back then. When I got home, I told my girlfriend how it had been my uncle who'd most likely murdered her mom's high school friend. And as you can imagine, that made for quite the talk, and we talked about it a lot, I guess. That's the thing that helped me more than anything. All the free therapy I got from being with someone who genuinely gave a damn about me. So much so that she never told her mom what she knew, at least not when we were together. Then over time, we just sort of moved past it. We broke up a few years later, totally unrelated. But I think about her a lot still, and how she helped me get past one of the single worst events of my entire adult and child life. I grew up in Greater Manchester in a single-parent family. It had always been me and my mom, so I never knew any different. And as much as I sometimes get a bit sad that other girls had dads at home, I love my mom more than anything, and I was grateful for her, As I got older, Mom would tell me things about my dad, what he was like, what he enjoyed, and eventually how he died. I was still very young when she told me, young enough for her to have to really explain what she meant. Saying Daddy and his friends were in a sailboat on the sea, and a big wave came and knocked them off the boat. Then Daddy and his friends went underwater, and that's when the angels came down and took them to heaven, because it's nicer in heaven than it is on the bottom of the sea. And it might sound a bit grim, but years later when I was watching SpongeBob, I used to think the sea doesn't look all that bad. Actually, heaven must be brilliant. The kids just say and think the funniest things, don't they? Now, heavy sarcasm is implied there. And so, yeah, that's how I grew up, basically. Mom told me early enough for me to just get used to it, I suppose. So it didn't ever fill me with the angst or become the source of too much sadness for me. But then came the day when Mom told me the truth. And I'll be honest, that did change everything. As I've already touched on, Mom used to sometimes tell me about Dad, but only good things. Only ever the good things. He loved football. He loved a good Indian takeaway, and he'd worked for a building firm ever since he'd left school at 16. He sounded like a nice guy. He always looked after Mom, and he definitely never did anything like hit her or cheat on her. But when she was pregnant with me, he went on a lad's holiday to Spain to enjoy the last of his freedom before I was born and took a faithful boating trip. He went a little too far out to sea. The weather took a turn, and that was that only. That wasn't that. Because Mom only ever told me half the story. I was 23 when she asked me the question that kicked it all off, and I think I knew. From the moment she asked me that something bad was coming, I was over Athers for a cup of tea and a catch-up when she asked me out of the blue if there were things that I'd never told you about. Your dad, would you want to know them? I asked her what kind of things she was talking about and immediately suspecting that it was less than wholesome stuff, purely from the tone of her voice, and she told me that Dad sometimes did stuff that she didn't approve of. She'd been wondering if I'd only wanted to know the good parts about my dad, or the whole truth, like who he really was as a man. She wouldn't think any less of me if I said no. But the offer was on the table, and of course I said yes. Of course I wanted to know the full picture. People are complicated, and sometimes good people make bad decisions. I'm also not one to say something very moody and pretentious. Like some truths are better off buried, because I don't believe that at all. And I'm glad she told me the truth for the most part anyway, but I could never have been ready for what she was about to say. And so I wasn't exactly a planned pregnancy. You see, Mom and Dad had loved each other and knew they wanted kids, and they were also very happy in their relationship. So it was basically inevitable. But when Mom gave Dad the news that she'd missed her period, it hit him quite hard. He didn't take it hard. And from what Mom tells me, he was as happy as he was excited. But he definitely had this moment of, ah, crap, I need to get my life together. Mom said he wasn't the best at work, a good lad, but no one you'd consider for a promotion, so it looked like it was going to be quite a while before he got any serious money coming in. He got his head down and worked really hard, but Mom said that you could tell he was getting frustrated because he knew it'd be a hard road. But then he comes home from the football one day with a spring in his step, and when Mom asks him what schemes he's got going, he gives her the old never you mind. Mom said he acted like that for weeks too, acting like he was the walk's smartest man in England. And then one day that man disappeared. Not literally, of course, that came later, but the cheerful, smiley, happy-go-lucky version of Dad just disappeared. Mom said he was acting like something terrible had happened. I mean that level of sort of grief almost. She'd catch him staring off into space, eyes all wide and scared, like something terrible was following him around. She'd ask him what was the matter, but he'd just sort of lie and tell her everything was fine, even though it was blatantly not. He stayed like that for about a week, didn't improve at all. And then out of the blue, he tells Mom that he and his mate are going to Spain for that lad's holiday. I mentioned, to enjoy the last of his freedom. Mom's a bit surprised, but she thought that she understood his thought process. He was just mega stressed about having me on the way, and he needed some time to relax. So she just let him do his thing, and he flew out to Spain with his friend, and he was only supposed to be gone a week. But then a week went by, he didn't come home, and Mom started to get worried. She got in touch with the police, and after telling them where Dad had gone, they reached out to the Spanish police who went out looking for him. The Spanish police then found that Dad wasn't at any of the places he told Mom he was going. But while there was evidence of him entering the country using his passport, there was no evidence that he left that at least narrowed things down a bit for them. So they started checking things like hospitals and jails in the area, just in case something had happened. But they didn't find Dad anywhere. Mom said that she had to wait another week or so before she got the news, and when it came, she was devastated. A boat had washed up on a beach somewhere in southern Spain, and inside it were half a dozen empty sports bags and the bodies of 2 dead Englishmen. My dad and his friend Mom said 2 police liaison officers came to talk to her about it, the kind that come around to give you bad news. They told her how Dad and his friend had been shot at close range while out on a rented motorboat, which had then washed up on the beach after drifting at sea for some days. Neither the English or Spanish police knew exactly why Dad and his mate had been murdered, but they reckoned it probably had something to do with the cocaine residue they found in some of those empty sports bags. Mom was stunned because not only was it unlike Dad to have anything to do with drugs, but the cocaine must have been the thing he'd been so excited about, the thing that he thought was going to make him a load of money. It was a lot to handle, as you can imagine. Mom didn't think things could get any worse, but they did. It took a couple of weeks, but they got much, much worse about a week after those 2 liaison officers popped around to talk to Mom. They called her back with some very unwelcome news. Greater Manchester Police had obtained a warrant to search our house top to bottom because they suspected Dad was involved in a murder that had happened before he himself was killed. And Mom said the stress was so bad that she thought she might miss her Ryrie. She didn't thank God. But it was that bad. All these policemen walking around the house searching every nook and cranny for God knows what. It was awful for her. And it took ages before the police could tell her exactly what was going on. But when they did, it was even worse than she'd ever could have imagined. So around about the time Mom found that she was pregnant with me, Dad went into overdrive trying to bring more money in. Mom said that he looked into all sorts of stuff, all legal, of course. But then he met a guy in a kebab house named Muzi. Muzi was short for Mustafa, and although Mustafa had moved from Turkey to Manchester many years before, he was an active figure in the local Turkish community and kept lots of contact with his relatives back home. Dad used to stop by his kebab shop sometimes after going to watch the football and being the nice, friendly guy that he was, especially after a few pints. Dad and Muzzy used to talk a lot. He must have mentioned my mom being pregnant too, and how he needed money because it was Muzzy who told him that if he could get him 10 grand in cash, he could turn it into £250,000. In just over a month, we knew all this because Dad texted his mate about it, the one who was killed with him, and the Spanish police got access to all the messages because they recovered his phone from the body anyway. Dad texted his mate asking if he's got 5 grand lying around to go halves with him on Muzzy's little investment plan. My dad's mate was obviously mega skeptical about the whole thing. Like my dad, he needed time to get that amount of cash together, and he wanted to meet Muzzy to discuss it before they handed it over. But after they did meet to talk it out, it was full steam ahead. Apparently, Muzzy had mates in the Turkish mafia who smuggled all kinds of illegal stuff into the UK at the time. The British border authorities were stopping loads of their shipments coming through bigger ports, but that made it easier to smuggle smaller shipments of things like cannabis resin through smaller UK ports. Through his mafia connections, the 10 grand in cash would buy a pretty sizable but not easily detectable amount of product that would then reach like 20 times the amount of cash once it was sold to street dealers in the UK. All Muzzy wanted was a 50 grand handler's fee from the sales for getting everything up and running, and then my dad and his mate would have £100,000 each, a pretty life-changing amount of money at that time. And so Dad and his mate get the money to Muzzy. He gets it to his mates in the Turkish mafia, and then everyone has to wait while gone. He didn't get into too much detail. The ship had come in, the cargo had been unloaded, and then out of nowhere, a load of police swarmed the shipping container, and the product had been seized. There was nothing that could be done. The money was gone, but neither my dad nor his mate believed a single word of it. Muzzy been going on for months about how it was a sure thing, how his mates in the Turkish mafia had been smuggling millions of pounds worth of cannabis resin without so much as a sniff from the police or border control. Then the one time it's their money on the block, their shipment just gets jumped on, according to the text messages between Dad and his friend. Dad had asked Muzzy for proof the shipment had been seized. They couldn't exactly phone up and ask about the shipment container, but what they could do to make sure Muzzy was telling the truth was call up the police and ask if a particular person had been arrested and held, because they'd got to share that information with families of people or even reporters. Dad asked Muzzy who brought the container in and if they'd been arrested, but Muzzy claimed not to know any names, aside from his mates in the mafia, and he's not giving those up for anything. He said if they confront another 10 grand, they can try again. But aside from that, they were out of luck personally. I think it was the last bit that really drove Dad around the bend. He was absolutely convinced that Muzzy had robbed him. So all the offer of a second roll of dice was sort of like, I think you're that stupid that I reckon I can milk another 10 grand out of you. And he and his friend were furious, so they hatched a plan to get their 10K back from Muzzy. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very sophisticated plan, as all it involved was tying him up in a shed and essentially torturing him until he confessed what he'd done. They told him that they were up for trying another shipment, only double this time, to recoup their losses. Muzzy says okay, then agrees to meet them somewhere, to pick up the cash, and that's where Dad snatches him. He and his mate then tortured Mufaso with cigarette lighters, burning his bound hands and feet. But Muzzy wouldn't confess. They kept going, beating him up and burning him, and he gave them his bank details so they could take whatever money was in his account, but he still wouldn't confess to scamming them. The police don't know exactly what happened next, but Dad didn't end up taking any money, and Muzzy's body was found a few weeks later. So we think Muzzy died somehow while being tortured, and Dad was forced to dispose of his body. That's why they didn't touch his account, because emptying it would point the finger of suspicion at them if Muzzy's body was ever actually found. After that, Dad and his friend made a drastic decision. They were going to fly over to southern Spain, to a place where you could buy cocaine being smuggled in from Colombia, then get the train from there to Madrid, to Barcelona, and then to Paris, as they could get the ferry from Dover to Clay and avoid the much stricter airline security. I don't know how solid a plan that was, but it obviously didn't go down for my dad like that. Because after meeting someone out at sea on this little rented motorboat, he and his friend either got double-crossed right there or had their cocaine stolen when they were on their way back to land. The empty bags with the cocaine residue makes me think that it was the second one that they got intercepted somehow, because if the people they bought from wanted them dead, why toss empty bags into their boat? It doesn't add up. I think they were found by someone else, someone who either preys on the small boats that do dodgy deals in the Straits of Gibraltar, or someone they'd really pissed off, i.e. the Turks. You see, Muzzy was innocent. The police were able to confirm that a shipment of cannabis had been seized at Falmouth Harbor, so Muzzy wasn't lying, and my dad had tortured him for nothing. I just picture these Turkish gangsters already annoyed that their shipment got seized, and then one of their associates gets kidnapped and tortured. You wouldn't give a toss if his death was accidental. You'd want the people responsible dead. No one knows exactly how they tracked my dad and his mate down, but when there's two English guys wandering around southern Spain, asking around to buy cocaine, I suppose it doesn't take long for word to reach the wrong ears. I wrestled with the truth for quite a while afterwards, because obviously hearing all that changed the way that I thought about my dad. I don't hate him, I still love him, even though I've never met him. But I do think he was stupid. I know he did what he did out of love for me and my mom, and there's a small part of me that loves and respects him for that. But a much bigger part of me wishes he'd stuck to something much safer and much more legal. Because if he had, I'd still have a dad in the small city of Amstetten in Lower Austria. There stands a gray three-story building consisting of a regular family home and an attached apartment building. It's a rather odd structure to perceive a combination of old and new that sit in subtle contrast with one another. But for its owner, the structure constituted his life's work. The owner, a retired electrical engineer, had the apartment building constructed in 1978 and even included a rooftop garden for the third floor, or apartment tenants reported him being reserved and polite. Yet he was also exceptionally strict, and of the many rules the building's owner enforced, the strictest of all was that which forbade tenants from entering the building's basement. You see, the owner of the building was a man named Joseph Fritzl, and he had a dark secret. Joseph Fritzl was born in Amstetten on April 9th of 1935. His father, Joseph Sr., abandoned his young family when Joseph was just 4 years old. Then 5 years later, his older brother was killed in action, fighting for the Germans during World War II. This left Maria, his mother, to raise little Joseph alone, who later claimed that she was both physically and emotionally abusive. At 18, Joseph began attending the HTL Technical College, graduating in 1956 with a degree in electrical engineering, and it was also around this time that he married a 17-year-old girl named Rosemary over the years that followed Joseph, and Rosemary would go on to have 3 sons and 4 daughters, including Elizabeth, who was born April 6th of 1966. But just 1 year after the baby girl's birth, her father began to exhibit some shocking changes in his behavior. In 1967, Fritzl began stalking a 24-year-old nurse in the nearby city of Lind. He kept his distance for a while, hiding in plain sight among crowded city streets. But then one day, having discovered the woman's husband was away from home, he broke into her house, held a knife to her throat, and then violated her. Fritzl was also said to be a suspect in the assault of another 20-year-old woman, as well as a case of indecent exposure, reported around the same time he was arrested, then put on trial for his crimes. But shockingly, an Austrian judge sentenced him to a mere 18 months in prison, of which Fritzl only served 12 following his release from prison. Fritzl was employed by an Amstetten construction firm and then later worked as a traveling salesman. Unsurprisingly, his shockingly short prison sentence had done nothing to reform him, and in 1977 he did something unthinkable and began physically abusing his 11-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and this abuse continued for 6 long years. Then, after completing her compulsory education at the age of 16, Elizabeth began a vocational course which focused on the food and beverage industry. This required Fritzl to grant his daughter more and more freedom. Freedom she thoroughly took advantage of, as just a few months after beginning the course, she fled to the Austrian capital of Vienna in the company of a friend, sadly, since Elizabeth was still 16 and not legally an adult in the eyes of the law. She was returned to her family after being tracked down by federal police. Some believe that as a way of averting another escape attempt, Elizabeth's return prompted her authoritarian father to become more lenient. But if that was indeed his new approach, it was nothing but a ploy. By the summer of 1984. A now 18-year-old Elizabeth had completed her vocational course and had been offered employment nearby. Linz Fritzl knew that he was going to lose her, that there was no way in hell his daughter turned victim would volunteer to stay. And so he got to work for months. Fritzl began working on a not-so-secret project in the basement of his home. He undertook such projects so often that it appears not even Elizabeth had any suspicion of his plans. Then on August 28th of 1984, Fritzl asked her for assistance in carrying a door down into the basement. Elizabeth obliged her father then. After picking up one end of the door, she helped him carry it into a small windowless room that looked almost like a makeshift prison cell. She began to panic and asked if she could exit the basement. Her father responded by clamping an ether-soaked towel over her face before sealing her prison cell closed with the very same door she helped to carry. Once she realized her teenage daughter was missing, Rosemary Fritzl filed a missing persons report with the local police department. Detectives opened an investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance. Just over a month later, Fritzl approached law enforcement with a handwritten letter purported to be from Elizabeth. The letter had been postmarked in a town just less than 100 miles away and explained that she was tired of living with her family, confirmed to have been written in the girl's handwriting. The letter also explained that any attempt to find her would result in her fleeing the country. Fritzl told police that he believed his daughter had joined some kind of New Age cult. In reality, she had been forced to write the letter whilst being held in her father's basement. Over the next 2 decades, Fritzl entered the basement on an almost daily basis, supplying his daughter with food and other essentials before violating her repeatedly. Since Fritzl made no attempt to use contraceptive devices, Elizabeth gave birth to a total of 7 children throughout the 24 years of her captivity. One passed away not long after childbirth, but 3 of them, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were allowed to live with Fritzl and his wife following the approval of local child protective services. This was only possible due to Fritzl's previous conviction being expuned, as at the time even despicable crimes, like violation of others, were stricken from the record. After 25 years, Fritzl explained to the authorities, who were already under the impression that Elizabeth had joined a cult, that she simply did not wish to raise her own children to confirm they were fit parents. The authorities sent out social workers on several different occasions, but not a single one saw or heard anything suspicious, and after a few months the visit ceased in 1994, and following the birth of his 4th child by incest. Fritzl decided to enlarge the underground cell housing his now 28-year-old daughter and their first 3 children. He put Elizabeth and the children to work, making them dig out soil with their bare hands until more than 200 square feet had been added to their lodgings. It's also believed their work was incentivized by the additions of amenities, such as a CD player. Then later a television with an integrated video cassette player. Fritzl then installed a refrigerator and hot plate in the basement so that Elizabeth could cook and feed their children at her leisure. He also charged her with the children's education and punished her failures by shutting off their power or refusing to bring them food. On one such occasion, Elizabeth threatened an escape attempt. Fritzl responded by saying that if any such attempt took place, he would flood the basement with carbon monoxide and suffocate them. He later claimed to have electrified the door to their cell, and that any attempts to free themselves would result in sudden and fatal electric shocks. This was later determined to be untrue. Fritzl had rigged up no such fatal mechanisms, yet the prospect terrified Elizabeth, and along with their captive children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix. Such threats ensured their continual compliance. As you can imagine, Fritzl spent a considerable amount of time in the company of his captive second family, but he did so without drawing suspicion through what one social worker described as a plausible explanation. Fritzl told his wife and tenants that the basement constituted his office, and since he drew up plans for devices intended for use by multi-million-dollar manufacturing companies, his work had to be kept secret from potential corporate spies. In order to maintain the ruse, Fritzl went so far as to create what was ostensibly an active workshop in his basement and concealed the entrance to Elizabeth's living quarters behind a total of 8 electronically locked doors. These doors could only be opened using a remote control Fritzl carried on his person, giving Fritzl much-needed peace of mind. But that didn't mean there weren't a couple of close calls one night. One of Fritzl's tenants claimed to have heard a noise coming from the basement. Fritzl promised to investigate, then returned saying that he'd fixed some faulty pipes and that the tenant wouldn't be hearing any more noises for 24 years. Fritzl kept his second family a deep, dark secret, and the level of security he employed gave him no reason to suspect his scheme would come to light until one day something happened that changed everything. On the morning of April 19th, 2008. Fritzl entered the basement to find that Kirsten, his eldest daughter from Elizabeth, had become severely ill. Elizabeth begged her father to allow Kirsten to be taken to the hospital, fearful that she might die. He agreed. Elizabeth then helped him carry Kirsten upstairs, whereupon she saw the outside world for the first time in her young life. The girl was then taken to the hospital by ambulance after her mother was forced back into their cell at Amstetten. Kirsten was discovered to be suffering from a life-threatening kidney infection. Yet while Fritzl tried his best to explain the events leading up to her illness, doctors began noticing glaring inconsistencies in his story. For example, Fritzl didn't seem to know how many children he had. He also presented doctors with a note written by Kirsten's mother, Elizabeth, after claiming to have severed all contact with her. The police were alerted, and on April 21st of 2008, they broadcasted a public appeal for information regarding Elizabeth and her whereabouts. Fritzl once again asserted that public appeal for information regarding Elizabeth and her whereabouts. Fritzl once again asserted that Elizabeth had run off to join a cult and went so far as to name the cult and gave police a description of their practices. Yet when officers contacted an acclaimed expert on the occult, Manfred Wolfart, he claimed that he had no knowledge of any such organization, fictional or otherwise. Yet when officers contacted an acclaimed expert on the occult, Manfred Wolfart, he claimed no knowledge of any such organization, fictional or otherwise. Yet on the contrary, and after examining letters supposedly written by Elizabeth, he had noticed some rather familiar indicators regarding her writing. Firstly, and despite being a woman in her late 20s, Elizabeth seemed to possess the vocabulary of someone 3 times her age. Secondly, there seemed to be a pattern of unusually large spaces between every third or fourth word, suggesting the girl had taken her pen off the page to listen out for someone's dictation. In other words, someone had either forced Elizabeth to write the letter or had a great deal of say in what was written as police decided to reopen the now decades-old investigation into Elizabeth Fritzl's disappearance. Fritzl returned to the basement and tried to calm his terrified daughter. Elizabeth seemed convinced that little Kirsten would pass away and demanded to be at her child's bedside in order to comfort her. It's here that Fritzl made his first but ultimately fatal error in his despicably evil scheme, and that he believed that he could come between a mother and her child. Many believe grave threats were exchanged, that a usual placid Elizabeth became vicious in the face of her father's denials. It's unclear exactly what was said during the exchange, but what we do know is that on April 26th of 2008, he released Elizabeth and their 2 sons, Stefan and Felix, and then brought them upstairs to join the rest of the family. Elizabeth headed straight for the hospital, and possibly in the hopes of containing the situation, Fritzl followed. But once he was there, and following a tip-off from suspicious doctors, police detained both Fritzl and his daughter, then took them away for questioning at the police station. Elizabeth issued officers with a shocking prerequisite to her cooperation. She would only answer their questions if they could guarantee that under no circumstances whatsoever would she ever have to lay eyes on her father ever again. Then, and only then, did she begin to tell the story of her 24 years in captivity. Perhaps one of the worst details officers heard that day was Elizabeth's explanation of how her father would violate her in the presence of their children. He would show them adult entertainment using the video cassette player, then would force Elizabeth to reenact what they saw on screen while the children watched nearby. Fritzl was swiftly arrested before his family members were taken into care. Then the following night, investigators gained access to the underground prison cell, using the secret keyless entry code, gazing in horror at the construction's crude sophistication on April 29th. 2 days after Fritzl was taken into custody, DNA evidence confirmed him as the biological father of Elizabeth's children. Her mother claimed no knowledge whatsoever of her kidnap or detention. Police believe Fritzl had been planning to fake his daughter's rescue from the fictitious cult he blamed her disappearance on, but pursuant to the agreement that she would never have to see her father again. Elizabeth gave a videotaped testimony on July 11th, categorically disproving any such claim. Prior to his trial, Fritzl claimed every intimate interaction with his daughter was entirely consensual, but he still knew what he was doing was wrong. An extract from a communication with his lawyer read, "I always knew during the whole 24 years that what I was doing was not right and that I must have been crazy to do such a thing, yet it became a normal occurrence to lead a second life in the basement of my house." Regarding his treatment of the family he had with his wife, Fritzl stated, "I am not the beast the media make me out to be." Then with the regards to his treatment of Elizabeth and her children in the cellar, Lee explained that he brought her flowers as well as books and toys for the children and what he referred to as the bunker. Fritzl also mentioned watching movies with his second family, but conveniently failed to specify their content when asked why he chosen to imprison Elizabeth. Fritzl was frank in his explanation that she did not adhere to any rules once she became a teenager. "That's why I had to do something." He said, "I had to create a place where I could keep Elizabeth by force if necessary, away from the outside world." Fritzl also implied that the emphasis on discipline following the Germans' annexation of Austria which occurred when he was just a toddler, heavily influenced his authoritarian views regarding obedience to the family. Patriarch, when asked about his mother, Fritzl spoke at length, saying she was the best woman in the world. And as strict as it was necessary to be with a boy of his nature, he did, however, claim his mother used to beat him until he was, quote, lying in a pool of blood on the floor. It left me feeling totally humiliated and weak. He explained my mother was a servant and she used to work hard all of her life. I never had a kiss from her and I never cuddled, although I wanted it. I wanted her to be good to me, but she called me a demon, a criminal, and a no good. I had a horrible fear of her. Naturally, investigators believe that Fritzl's relationship with his mother explained his maladaptation, and what he told them thus far was merely the tip of the iceberg. In 1959, Fritzl and Rosemary had been married for almost 2 years when Fritzl's mother asked to move in with them. She was getting older and needed her son's help in caring for herself. So initially, Fritzl played the part of the beautiful son. He moved her into his attic, kept her comfy for a while, but over time, his treatment of her began to change. He began talking back to her and ignoring her requests, becoming more and more insolent as time went by, until one day his mother realized he was enacting a slow but terrible revenge. Fritzl fed his mother less and less food and allowed her less and less sunlight until eventually she was too weak to move. He bricked up her window and informed their neighbors she'd passed away, then gleefully told her own mother that the world outside thought she was dead. She was his first prisoner, the first woman he'd exercised complete and utter control over, and when she passed away in 1980, it's believed she remained a prisoner in the attic for up to 12 years straight. In a report by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Adelheid Kastner, who conducted extensive interviews with Fritzl, he described how his subject believed his pathological behavior was innate, as in he was born bad. Fritzl claimed to have always harbored evil thoughts, but that the plan to imprison Elizabeth came to him while he was serving his prison sentence back in 1967. He believed it would be a way of containing his, quote, evil side, saying, I was born to hurt women and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than just locking up my own daughter. Dr. Kastner swiftly diagnosed Fritzl as having a severe combined personality disorder and recommended he receive psychiatric care for the remainder of his natural life. Finally, on March 19th of 2009, after a harrowing 4-day trial, Fritzl pleaded guilty to the charges of the murder by negligence of his infant son and grandson Michael, as well as decades of enslavement, incest violation, coercion, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life in prison, but has recently been moved from a high-security psychiatric unit to a regular prison, whereby he can live out the rest of his life in relative comfort, according to a statement from an Austrian court. The now 89-year-old Fritzl no longer poses the same level of danger that required him to be kept in a secure psychiatric unit. They added that due to progressive dementia and physical frailty, he is, quote, no longer likely to commit a criminal offense with serious consequences. But can a man such as Joseph Fritzl truly be anything other than a clear and present danger to those around him? Or will those like him always pose an imminent and irredeemable threat to the most vulnerable in society? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel, and check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, Jim Chuck doesn't tuck.